You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskens, your host. As always, this week we are going to a brand new suburb that we've never covered in over 6 years, up in the city of Swan, and actually the Shire of Mundaring as well. It's one of those rare suburbs that crosses two local government authorities. It is Swan View, and there's one man we can talk about Swan View with. He's a number one agent in the area from the agency. It is Shane Schofield. Hey Shane, how you going?
Good, how are you?
Thanks
for inviting me in.
Thank you, mate, and thank you for coming down the hill into the studio. It is a suburb that I think a lot of people have probably driven past on the way up to the hills, maybe to check out the view of Perth, go on a romantic date, go in past the hills east into Kalgoorlie and these sort of places. You drive through it, but unless you're living in a place like Swan View, it might not be somewhere you've hung out very often, is it?
Yeah, correct.
When it comes to the big sell, the amenity, what life is like is in Swan View, why people would want to live there. Can you give us a bit of a spiel if you're selling the whole suburb for me?
It's affordable. The average price is about $664,000 at the moment. It has doubled over the last 4 years, but I guess in comparison to Perth, it's still affordable. It's family friendly. It's a little bit more laid back than being stuck in the city. Blocks are a bit bigger, schools, shops, parks. The national park is just up the top of Swan View. There's a lot to offer, I would say.
I guess it's in the name, but Swan View, what are the views we're talking about here? And where are they specifically in the suburb?
Swan View, there's three parts. So there's the flat part, which is on Morrison Road, and then as you head up Morrison Road, you start to get a little bit more elevated, and basically the higher you go, so does the price. So up the top of Swan View, you've got the $1 million to $1.3 million homes that have amazing city views, or they could face the other way because you're on top of the hill, the national park, John Forrest National Park. Actually, there was a petition many, many years ago. The top part of Swan View wanted to rename themselves Sunset Hill because they didn't want to associate themselves with the rest of Swan View, but it never went through.
Well,
so it's still called Swan View everywhere. So
that's actually a really interesting story because they're not the only suburb that have tried to rename themselves or rename part of themselves.
Okay.
For example, South Duncraig, they'll remind everyone that whilst they live in Duncraig, they live in South Duncraig. I know that there's been many attempts to try and change the name as well.
Yes.
Lockridge, for example, had a stain over many years with regards to that name, wanted to change the name to Pepperwood. There's a number of times where we've actually seen suburbs change name as well, and I should do an episode on that.
Yes.
Shane, I love talking about history, especially when it comes to the first establishment of suburbs and the setting out of suburbs. There's really cool old maps of most of the suburbs in Perth that sit in the West Australian Library. But Swan View, we know, is a very old suburb. It's been around for a long time. What can you tell us?
So basically, they built the railway from Bellevue to Chidlow, and they built a train station at Swan View. So the railway opened in 1895, and at the same time the railway opened, so we're going back around 130 years, they auctioned off 21 lots at £3 per acre. Back then it was just all bush, and that's basically how Swan View all started off. So the train line, it was the old steam train that was in operation until 1966, and then it was changed to the Avon Link, which we have today. But the old train line is still there, but they've turned it into a heritage walking trail. So you can actually walk from Swan View up to John Forrest National Park.
And that goes through the tunnel?
Yes, you can go through the tunnel, which some believe is haunted.
Well, it feels haunted when you're in there.
It does. It's a bit spooky. And so you can still walk through there and walk up to the national park, and there's waterfalls and winter, and yeah, it's a lovely spot.
Hey, it's really interesting to think that there was a time where you could buy an acre of land for £3.
I know, it's just crazy.
Think about the stamp duty on that, would have been a few cents.
Yes, not like today.
When we think about the demographic of people that live in Swan View, both in age and I guess in background, has that changed over the years since you've been living there, or is it still pretty solid?
It has changed. So I was looking at the census data, but just from my feel from being every weekend out there doing home opens, the last census to the one before, the average age has dropped by about 8 years. And I have noticed more and more younger people are moving into the area. The older people, maybe the block was a bit steep and they're downsizing to somewhere else in Perth that's a bit flatter. And they're coming in are the newer couples, generally first home buyers.
Chasing the price point.
That's right, exactly. So because it's an affordable suburb to move into.
Historically, has it been a fairly ethnic suburb?
Predominantly, say, Italians. We're very close to the Swan Valley, so you can get out to the Swan Valley in 10, 15 minutes. So there is a lot of Italian heritage. You know, there are some houses with the columns and the lions and beautiful people, and there are still some pockets where they still won't subdivide because they've still got that big half an acre and a lot of grapevines and veggie gardens. So
bit of market gardening still happening.
yeah, a little bit, that's right.
I mentioned that there's 2 local governments that cross Swan View.
Yes.
Very rare. East Vic Park's probably one of those suburbs we see where half of the suburb is town of Vic Park, the other half is the city of Canning. Swan View split between the city of Swan and the Shire of Mundaring.
Yes.
Do you notice it? Can you tell to the trained eye when you're in each shire? Does it make a difference?
No, you wouldn't know the difference. It's a bit of a pain. I don't know why they do that, but probably the biggest frustration with the residents is the bin service. So the Shire of Mundaring recently brought in the bin that you put all your garden waste in, which we didn't really need because in the Shire of Mundaring we get a free tip pass. And now they've reduced the small rubbish bin to fortnightly. So myself, I've a family of 4. We've got to try and fit everything into that one little bin every fortnight, where if you swap over to the city of Swan, literally over the road in some streets, they've got the big bins and they get picked up every week. So there's a little bit of jealousy with the bins there.
There you go. You never would have known.
No.
Do you notice the housing types or the age of the housing, anything like that is any different? Socioeconomics, or you really wouldn't know?
You wouldn't know between the shires except the rates. So Shire of Mundaring really get you with the rates. I live in the Shire of Mundaring. If I was in the city of Swan, my rates would be about $1,000 a year cheaper.
Yeah, wow.
So Mundaring is really, really expensive with rates.
And smaller bin.
We don't know why, and you get a smaller bin. So,
well, there you go, everyone. City of Swan seems to be the easier place to get around amongst Swan View. If I'm taking my kids to school, where are they going?
So in Swan View, you've got Swan View Primary School and High School. You've also got St Anthony's Catholic Primary School. So that's technically in Greenmount, but only a couple of minutes away. And then for a private high school, you've got Larsell College down in Vivash near Midland, and there's buses that take kids straight down there. It's only 5 or 10 minutes away.
Let's transition into that buyer and seller profile now. Now, you mentioned that the buyer profile has really started to open up into first home buyers given the price point and people being pushed to that part of Perth, I guess. Are these people in their 20s, 30s mainly? They got kids already? Where are they coming from if they're not first home buyers? Where were they living previously?
Just in the last 6 months, for example, most first home buyers have been childless. They're just starting off. They want to buy their first home and then start a family.
They've come from the local area?
Yeah, a lot of them have come from the local area. Probably it's split a little bit. I guess we can see on the offers where they've lived before. So we sometimes call it the flat bit of Perth. So maybe they've come from somewhere else in Perth and they can see the value and the benefits of living in Swan View. Then there's also the upgraders, $500,000 and less properties, not that there's many anymore left. They were the first home buyers, and then sort of the $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 homes, 4x2, maybe 800 square metres, upgrading from another house in Swan View or around the area, and they just want a bit more space because maybe now they've got kids or the kids are grown up a little bit. So,
and who's selling and why?
I've actually sold a lot of properties for investors because they don't like all the changes that have come in. So a lot of people that were maybe 60 plus and they potentially owned the property and they were renting it out, decided that it's actually better to sell it while the market's hot and put the money in a term deposit rather than rent it out because they don't like the rules that have come in for the owners. So
that's a really pertinent point, and we haven't had that one on the podcast recently, but it's certainly one that you would expect is a reality given the changes to the Rental Tenancies Act. Across Perth, we've noticed that listings have increased by about 60% from winter to recently, and it started to level off now as demand has really picked up over the 1,000 transactions a week in Perth the last month, and people bringing their property to markets are probably holding off until after Christmas. So we are seeing that leveling off now in the mid 5,000s, which again is way undersupplied still in Perth. But of that cohort of people that have brought their property to market in spring selling season, we'll call it, why were they doing so? If it wasn't for the Tenancy Act, firstly, I should ask, did you notice, is there more listings available in your area than there were over winter, and why?
Yes, there is. So I guess Swan View, especially up the top bit where you get the views, and the blocks are mainly half an acre to an acre. There's a couple that are a bit bigger as well. They generally have big gardens, a view, and I guess you don't want to sell one of those properties when there's a bushfire in the background and helicopters flying over. So in winter and spring, it's all nice and green and it's not too hot. So those sort of properties tend to sell in spring, and that's my busiest time of the year. Where the flatter bit of Swan View all year round, because I guess they're just your general everyday site sort of block. So
This is really interesting. It's quite the answers you're giving me very site specific and talks to the realities of why people may be bringing their property to market at certain times of the year versus others, which is different to the answer closer to the city and seeing just the environmental factors is one I haven't heard before.
Yes.
Now, Swan View's grown 20% in the last year. It's pretty much on track with the rest of Perth. It's a median price area these days. Rental growth up 20% as well. But places like Bellevue and Greenmount have grown 40 to 30%.
Yes.
This is crazy numbers. What's going on there compared to Swan View?
Sometimes with the smaller suburbs, the figures can be a little bit skewed. So Bellevue and Greenmount are much smaller suburbs than Swan View.
So it's a smaller sample size and it's a bit more variability.
That's right. So if you have a few houses that sell for a really high price, it's going to skew the figures a little bit. However, I did have one in Bellevue that we got a record price, and I guess it was a suburb that no one really thought about too much. Greenmount, I grew up in Greenmount, and that is quite sought after. The prices are a little bit more expensive than Swan View. You have some better views, and it's a little bit more of a niche market, and some of the houses there are quite spectacular. So
that's where I was going to lead to. Is it possible that given the massive increase in construction costs and therefore replacement cost of these houses, that is what is being reflected in the increase in value, is that a lot of these properties are just bigger, nicer houses, and therefore, given the replacement cost has gone up that much more for those houses, it's overall a larger part of the growth, if that makes sense, compared to probably older, cheaper houses in Swan View?
Yeah, correct. And Greenmount has a lot of maybe 1930, 40, 50 homes that they've renovated, done all the bells and whistles, and they're the ones that are getting the top prices. They could still be on half an acre or so, decent amount of land and a nice view. So,
what's the cheapest thing I could buy in your suburb?
So you could probably get a little unit near Coles in Swan View for probably $300,000, like a 2x1 unit.
What was that going for 3 or 4 years ago?
You couldn't sell some of them. There was just so many around, like $180,000.
Yeah.
My wife and me are still kicking ourselves. Next to Swan View, there's a suburb called Stratton, which is a bit cheaper than Swan View. And we sold this property for $220,000. It needed a lot of renovation. But now today, that one would be worth probably $550,000 or more.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so that cheapest property there, small 201, older unit next to the shops.
Yes.
You're in the 300,000s now. What's next?
Unit-wise, there's not a lot of units. So there's 204 units in Swan View. And there's around 3,500 homes.
Wow. There's not a lot of choice there for people downsizing or starting their property journey, is it?
That's right. So there's a few, I'd say probably maybe 3 or 4 complexes of units. There's quite a few duplexes around that are on 1,000 square metres divided into 2. But then it sort of jumps up to your 3x1 on 600 square metres. And at the start of the year, we were listing them from $499. And then people were coming in and offering $100,000 more straight off the bat. A lot of interstate investors. But now I don't really hear from the investors. Now the prices for a 3x1 on say 600 or 700 square metres, now 600 plus. I guess for the investors, it doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, the repayments and what they're going to get back in rent, it doesn't line up too well.
Are the East Coast investors still talking to you, or that's all dried up?
I still get a few phone calls, but it has dried up a bit.
And I suppose that's a bit of an opportunity there. The East Coast investors I've seen throughout Western Australia over the last 4 years really have been a locust plague that have come through, inflated prices in certain areas, and really just bid up the local Western Australian who's trying to access the property.
Correct.
As a first home owner, let alone investor. And now that they've sidestepped and probably looking back in their own community, it does start to open up the opportunity for people in West Australia, granted at a much higher price than it was 4 years ago, but there seems to be slightly less competition at the negotiation table. And although the reports are that agents are still getting prices above their expectations, it's a bit more of a civil conversation now about what we're paying in amongst 3 or 4 people rather than 20 people.
That's right. It has slowed down, and I had to actually do my first price reduction in probably 4 years to a house in Swan View a few weeks ago.
Was it simply because there was no one looking to buy, or was the reason because your expectations are probably a little bit ambitious?
I think the expectations were a little bit ambitious at the start, but we did sell it just under what the asking price was, so still a great result from what the owner bought it for 3 or 4 years ago, so he's still done quite well out of it. This particular one was originally from $649, and we didn't really have the interest there. It had been subdivided, so it was probably an 800 square metre block roughly, split into 2. So there wasn't much backyard, so that was quite a put off for a lot of families looking to move into the area. So then we listed it at from $599 and we got $593.
Okay.
So still a good result because I think he paid $340 for it 4 years ago. He's still done quite well out of it.
If you look at it in hindsight, would it have been more efficient to have listed it in the high 500s and see how we go? Did the higher listing come from the owner's instructions and was it just a bit too lofty? I've seen that a few times in Perth over the last year where, to be frank, the only reason we don't see offers come into the table is because the seller's expectations are unrealistic. They're having a lend, essentially.
Yes.
Did that happen in this situation?
Yes and no. I thought we could possibly get a little bit more as well, but I guess our conversation was just in that last month or two, the market has changed a bit and shifted. And of course, when we listed this one property, at the same time in that same week, there was like 6 other listings that were exactly the same, whereas when we did the appraisal and first looked at it, there wasn't much around at all.
That really does speak to the reality right now that whilst we are still very undersupplied compared to where we were 4 months ago, buyers now have a second to think and have choice.
Yes.
Whereas before, it was simply access. They just needed a roof over their head. And these were the 3 things available in Swan View. And now there's 10. And whilst there is still a buyer or more for every single one of these 10 properties, they at least have an opportunity to make a choice now and have a think about it. And still only one person can buy each one of these properties. But the FOMO has probably left most of the market now, I think. And now it's a case of really just going back to that fundamentals of, do we have more buyers than sellers in each suburb? And in each of those suburbs, can the buyers afford the price the seller is asking for? And for the most part, the answer is still yes, there is a buyer for every property in every suburb. But if the seller is going to have a lend and put that property in the market for 10% more than really where the market is at, which is 70% more than it was 5 years ago, then you're probably not going to have anyone rock up to your open because there are 9 other people in your suburb who are putting it on the market for a fair price in 2024.
That's right. And it all comes back to, I know when I first started, the 3 Ps of real estate. It's got to be presented well, promoted well, and priced well. So all the houses that I sell where the owners have put in that extra effort, mulched the garden, made it present really, really well, we've promoted it well, and it's priced fairly, they will sell. So the ones that don't seem to sell are the ones that maybe need a little bit more work done to them, or they're a bit overpriced.
Let's move up the price point again. I assume the housing type is an original house on a full block?
Yes, so I guess the next step up would be maybe looking at a 4x2 on 800 square metres. Recently sold one for $800,000. That one was quite a nice home. It was listed at from $769, so sold in the first weekend.
Isn't that interesting? In the same time frame here, we're having a conversation about a property with a little bit less to offer, not overachieving, and then a property that ticks every box, 4x2, full block, same suburb, same time frame, you overachieve.
That's right. And then the top of the market, 11 Parkway in Swan View, that one was on half an acre with views of the national park. So I guess we're at the top of the price bracket. We listed it from $995 and we got $1,125,000. And my wife and me were at the home open and we had about 30 groups of people through. And it sold in the first weekend.
And when was this?
Around the same time as well.
Yeah.
So it just goes to show, 4x2s are always generally sought after a little bit more. And with the one that sold for over the $1 million range, a lot of the buyers were from other parts of Perth where they can maybe sell their $2 million house and go, oh, wow, for $1 million, we can get this massive house on half an acre.
Yeah. And that's a lot of Perth where people forget everyone's made money over the last few years as long as they've been in the market. So they're taking their equity and putting it to areas where they'd like to or would rather be. And
that's right.
That's what I think 2025's theme is going to be. As I've said in this podcast for the last few weeks now, it is a flight to amenity. People are making their upsize, possibly now having the mobility to do their downsize as well after years of not being able to leave because there's nowhere to go.
Yes.
Mobility is going to open up massively in 2025 because there's just a bit more choice. People are starting to be a bit more fluid, making their decisions. They've got equity now, interest rates dropping, so their serviceability goes up. Finally, there's just going to be a lot less friction in this market. And I think everyone's happier for that. Not only the real estate agents who have got more transactions, more listings coming through and not fighting tooth and nail for one of the listings that are open this week, but it really does allow people to move on with their lives. And the cool thing that you've noted across these 3 examples you've just given us is that the most expensive property outperformed by 15%. The second most expensive property outperformed by 7%. But it was the cheaper property that had less to offer that didn't outperform.
That's right.
And that's because clearly people are making smart decisions in those options, where they're still chasing amenity, they'll pay what they have to.
Yes, and I have in the lower price bracket, just in the last week, I have noticed a few other listings have reduced their price as well. So they were from $599, now they're mid to high 500s.
Yep.
I think that bit of the market jumped up just way too quick.
Oh yeah, they've
And-
essentially doubled in the space of 3 years.
Yeah, or even just this year, like at the start of this year, like I was saying, we had one from $499, and I thought we might get $530, possibly $540, and an Eastern States investor came in and just went bang, 600,000.
Yeah.
So then everyone else thinks, well, my house is worth
Must
600,000.
be. Whereas 3 years ago it was in the 400s max.
Yeah, or even 300, some of them.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just been a bit of a roller coaster.
And that is, I think, one thing that everyone listening has to remember. You hear conversations that have come out in the last couple of weeks. We were going for 640, we got 590. But let's think about this here. As you just said, Shane, 3 years ago, we were in the 300s in some of these properties.
That's right.
So let's just relax and recognize that we've had insane growth, and that some of the price points we're now looking for on properties that are pretty low on amenity, pretty low on internal value, replacement value, they've had runs that are unsustainable. And it's now going to be people moving from that equity, with that equity, to the places they'd rather be. That will be the next market in 2025. I really strongly do advise that this is where the market is going to migrate. They're migrating up the amenity curve. They don't have any less money. They've got more equity. They're going to have more serviceability next year. The market will still be hot. There'll still be more buyers than sellers. It's just that they're going to shift from places they have to be because that's all they can afford, to places they want to be because now they can afford it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
Shane, let's talk about subdivision and development for a second. I know there's not a lot of it that happens in Swan View.
Yes.
But there is potential. There is zoning in Swan View in the city of Swan and the Shire of Mundaring for subdivision via the R20/35 in the city of Swan and the R40 pockets in the Shire of Mundaring. Do you see a lot of it, or is it pretty rare that you see someone do it?
Some of the big half an acre blocks have been subdivided into, like, they built a house behind a house. But the one that I have seen pop up most recent is R20/R35, because most of the properties were R20, where it sounds great, but in reality, most of those blocks are, let's say, 800 to 900 square metres, but the house is right in the middle of the block. So to subdivide it, you've got to knock the house down to build two, which there's no money in that for a developer.
Yeah.
However, I have seen two just recently. One of them I sold where just luckily they built the house over to the side because they had a big shed on the other side, but the buyer has seen that potential that he can remove the shed and split it straight down the middle, make some money that way. So.
Yeah. Okay. So because of the size of the house and the location of the houses, most of these subdivisible properties probably don't have the capacity financially to happen at this point in time, but there is that long-term potential for a lot of the properties.
That's right, and everything's single story mainly in that lower end of Swan View. Further up the hill you do get two-story homes, but I guess where a lot of the rezoning has occurred, it's just sort of single story, and there's no money really in it to do a double-story townhouse or something. So,
and that's because of the price point.
That's right.
People aren't going to end up paying you that extra amount just because it's a second story.
Exactly.
I got one more question for you.
Sure.
With the median house price, which currently sits at $622,000, what would you be buying in Swan View right now?
If I could, I would buy like a 4x2, because they always seem to be the ones that most people want either to rent out or buy later on. You know, maybe a 4x2 that needs a little bit of work, because a lot of them could have been built in the 70s or 80s, so they could have original fixtures and fittings. You could possibly pick one up because maybe the owners are downsizing.
And if you had an unlimited amount of money, what would be your favourite house on your favourite street that you'd buy?
I would go right up the top of Morrison Road, and then you turn left and you're on Curve Road. I sold one there recently, the Parkway, and you don't get views of the city because you're on the other side of the hill, but you just get these amazing, beautiful views of the national park. You got kangaroos coming up on your lawn. Yeah, a beautiful location. And, you know, you can walk down to the John Forrest National Park and the Swan View train tunnel, and all within, you know, walking distance. So
Shane Schofield from the agency, #1 agent in Swan View. Thanks so much for your really candid, honest and informative advice today about the suburb. It's one we haven't looked at for 6 years, but I think it certainly speaks a story about the escalation of people's interest in the area and the amenity changes that happen in one single suburb like Swan View, from bottom of the hill to top of the hill, and how that story starts to unfold as people move up the hill. literally and figuratively.
That's right.
Thanks, Shane.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!